For life. We'll wait for people to join before we get going because once we get going, we don't stop until it's time to stop.
I like it. Hi, everyone.
Welcome, welcome. If you've been following these conversations, then you know we are talking about things like death and dying and theology and where they intersect. And today, once folks get logged on, we're going to try to dig into this trend that seems to be happening in Beatrice's work, writing about death, and maybe I got to talking to someone because I sent them your article. And we both were like, do people understand how she is using this language? And I wonder, just in the spirit of good scholarship and being wise with our words, maybe we start with, because some of these people are new who are logging on who maybe haven't read your book, Sister Death. And I know that we did a live about that last year, I think, before we started more regularly talking. So maybe we can just kind of contextualize death and dying and is theology dying and help people understand how you're using these frameworks so that we can kind of get up to speed.
Yeah, so I wrote a book about death, which you mentioned. It's called Sister Death, and in that book, I'm talking about like the political theology of death, which for me means it's not just a theological way of thinking about death. It can be, but it's not only that. It's also a way of thinking and talking about death that happens on in the public sphere in a more secular context. And so the way that, Christian theology has been talking about death for centuries differs in different contexts. There's lots of different sort of Christian ways of thinking and talking about death, but there is a pretty predominant um, viewpoint or theology that has developed that sees life and death as enemies.
Yeah.
And what I'm critiquing in that book is this view that life and death are enemies. And I'm arguing that this is an idea that shows up in theology, but it also shows up in secular contexts. It's pretty endemic. It's a viewpoint that has gotten its tentacles into all kinds of aspects of culture and life. And I essentially don't think it's true. I
Right.
don't think that life and death are enemies. I think that life and death are not friends exactly. I know that that's another sort of philosophical viewpoint that life and death are friends, and I also don't particularly think that that's true, in part because I think that there's a lot of hostility and antagonism and tension between life and death, and I think a lot of that's necessary. If we want to survive, we have to be in some tension against death. So I describe them as sisters, and I borrowed that idea actually from Francis of Assisi. He's got this hymn where he talks about death as a sister, and he talks about it as our sister. I'm thinking about it as life's sister, but I also think of sisterhood as something that has a lot of tension built into it.
Yeah.
Sisters don't
Okay.
always get along. So that's kind of the idea about death in that particular book. But I'm constantly thinking about death and mortality. For me, I think that in some ways, theology is a field that's sort of designed to think about this stuff. And I think that, from some points of view, you could even argue that um, thinking about death is the place that people begin from when they start to think about things like God. So I think that theology is really always about mortality. But I think theology often wants to get to the kind of like post-mortal view on things. It wants to kind of see the world from more of a God's eye view or a God's eye perspective. And I feel like people often kind of rush to that point. People rush to sort of get to that kind of redemptive viewpoint or that hopeful viewpoint. And I think that it's worth spending time with the presence of death, thinking and talking about these things. So, um, when I talk about theology and theology dying, I'm thinking about theology as something that's mortal, right? All things are mortal. The earth itself is mortal. All things die eventually, which means that anything, any kind of public conversation or public institution is mortal. But what I've been kind of interested in for the past couple of years is thinking more specifically about academic theology. So I'm not necessarily talking about like Pete Hegseth on, the news talking about um,
Holy war and that brand of political theology, which I would say is in conversation with mortality and death and violence all the time.
It is, I think, in a kind of triumphalist way, right?
Right,
Right, where
right,
it's this perspective where, we're the winners, we're on the side of life, our God is on the side of life, and it's gonna, our God is gonna defeat death and all of the friends of death, and we're gonna put them to death because they don't deserve
right,
to live.
right,
And that's kind of the framework. And that kind of theology is obviously not dying. I mean, it's alive
right,
and well, it's out there, it's all over
right.
the place. There's a
But
ton
but
of
but you wrote this article. You wrote this article, which I keep referring to because I want people to read it. Because I think we need to have this conversation more broadly, beyond the academic disciplinary regime and the institutional regime. I think people to people need to be having these conversations around a larger question, I think, about the humanities. And so I would love to start with your article and tease it out a little bit for the folks who have joined, and then get into some of the larger implications of what it means if theology is dead or dying.
so the the kind of theology that I've been sort of thinking and talking about when I am reflecting on its mortality is the the institution of theology as it exists in like contemporary academic settings in the United States today. So I'm thinking about the kinds of places where you and I earned our PhDs,
Right,
right? And I think I started thinking about this before the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And I think that to some extent, there's always been a lot of fear around the humanities and what's happening to the humanities. And I think that the fate of the humanities often seems to influence the fate of religious studies and theology, even though a lot of people in religious studies aren't even humanists. They're more social scientists or
right,
anthropologists. But
right,
I do think that, departments of religion tend to be, a part of that block of academic departments that gets associated with the humanities. And so, to the extent that there is a fate for those departments, it often tends to be linked up with the humanities. So,
right,
the kind of institutional vulnerability of the humanities also is institutional vulnerability for conversations about religion and theology. And so I have been more specifically interested in conversations about religion and theology because I think that even in the context of the humanities, they're more vulnerable. Because I think that lots of people in the humanities don't even think we should be talking about that kind of stuff in
right,
academic settings in the first
r-
place.
right, right,
That these kinds of things don't belong in institutions of higher education anymore. They belong to like the past of higher education. This is stuff that people used to talk about in like the old world. This
right,
is, an inheritance of a world that we don't live in anymore. We
right,
live in a world that's not supposed to be religious now. And so why should we be talking about things like religion and theology in higher education? So there's a lot of people who think that. And, you know, to that extent, I think there's lots of people who don't particularly care about whether we're talking about religion or theology in academic settings. Um, and, I think that there's also just like a decline in mainline seminaries. I
yeah,
think, many of them are still kind of holding on, but I do think that, mainline churches are shrinking and the seminaries that train pastors and other people to work in those mainline churches, those seminaries are shrinking as well. Some of them are kind of reinventing themselves, but some of them aren't necessarily. And lots of those institutions don't even really want to teach theology anymore. They want to teach more practical courses.
right,
They don't
right,
really want to teach like esoteric like theoretical ideas courses. They want to teach
right,
more, things with practical applications. So I think even in those places where you would expect to see theology being like really protected, it's often not. And so essentially, I think that as we're watching in the public sphere, um, theology is just becoming more and more present, I think. It's, religion's becoming more and more politicized. But I do also think that we're also watching a lot of institutional disinvestment in having these kinds of conversations, and a lot of the structures where we've kind of gotten used to having um, disciplines where we talk about this stuff. Those things are disappearing as well.
Yeah, I'm not gonna take the time to look it up, but I think I read a news article or a headline that, it was like a religious news service article, I think, that the United Church of Christ here in the United States cannot has too many churches and not enough pastors. And, I feel very curious about ritual life and ceremony, and are those things with the death of theology within the vulnerability of academic institutions and disciplines being collateral damage of divestment. What is that doing to ceremony and ritual life and um the kind of psychic containers that are built in cathedrals and, for people to experience transcendence and immanence? I feel very curious about that.
I think that there's also, parallel to the disinvestment, like the institutional disinvestment in these fields in general. I think there is also just in the United States a disinvestment in collective spaces.
Right.
I think we're watching just so much financial investment in technology, in AI, and there's all this like structural investment in um essentially things that don't necessarily like actually bring us together, and I think increasingly things that have been making us feel more divided
Yeah.
and more
Yeah.
separate from one another. But there isn't actually a lot of actual real investment in things like park spaces and the public in
Right.
general. Even just the roads that we drive on, right? Like notoriously, there's just been a lot of public disinvestment in um, anything that might like roughly be considered the commons. And I think that has that is this it's the same with collective life, ritual, things like that
Yeah.
bring people together. And I do think that historically, in the United States at least, it has been religious organizations and institutions that have been there um to develop that sense of connection between people in those you know, civic or quasi-civic spaces. But I also think that increasingly it's become the case that in the U.S., um, religion has been so politicized that I
Right.
think, many people on the left don't want to be like, they don't want to be there for any kind of event organized by religious people. And often religious events are not, when they're organized, are not necessarily for civic purposes or, for the purpose of civic gathering.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think about some of the times that I have been asked to show up at an action, and I have to make the very careful choice of, do I wear my clergy collar or not? And I wear it as a symbol because symbols speak, and then I try to align my practices with the symbol and hope that it doesn't, damage relationships. But uh showing up in a clergy collar in rural America is, uh the church has not been friendly to people out here. And the churches out here are churches that believe in a set propositional faith doctrines, and it creates exclusionary theologies, and so, um I get really worried about, how do you do theology in a place that theology has harmed so many people. And obviously, we can both look at American evangelicalism and see the harm that has been perpetuated since the 80s when the right began to organize. And your article about the death of theology and the kind of spiritual or religious death that is happening on the left, where one of the things I wonder about is how I also don't like these binaries of right and left, because it is all under the umbrella of 19th century liberalism, and we forget our history about how this shit has evolved. But on the left, to use the language that is popular right now, there is kind of a death happening there between people disassociating from religion and spirituality and really giving up on any of that. And I have to say, makes sense to me.
And I think a lot of people genuinely, I think, I mean, I'll hear people talk about this, and, people will sometimes say, well, everybody needs religion, right? Everybody needs something like religion. And I think genuinely some people just don't. I just think there's some people who are just not into it. And that's totally fine. And I get it. I also do, though, think that there are a lot of people who maybe have gotten to a point in their life where they don't think of themselves as religious anymore, or they have like a sense of connection to something in their past, but at this point in time they don't feel religious, but they want something like it, but not exactly, but
Right.
kind of. And we don't really have a lot available
No.
that meets that sort of, in between space, or that sort of demand. And I think wellness is like probably the closest thing, just these various like sort of wellness communities that
Yeah.
people kind of flock towards. But I think that we're really at a point where like a lot of those also just feel kind of bankrupt to people, because I think
Totally.
everybody's sort of like, oh, you're just trying to get money from me, or, you're
Yeah.
trying to, you're trying to sell me something. And I think that's, I don't know. I think we've kind of hit a little bit of an end of the road to some extent with a lot of that stuff.
Mm.
And, um,
Good riddance. Good riddance to that. I mean, I really hate the sort of performative wellness community that um that people are creating without any kind of professional, not professional, because there is a professionalization of health and wellness that I don't like. But you know there there is methodology to creating health and wellness. It's not just a transaction. It's not just an event. Um, it's a process. And so much of the world right now is riddled in bankrupt transactions versus relational processes that I would say allow for things like becoming and generative change and things like that.
and there's a really big difference between planting an herb garden in your backyard and growing herbs because you want to grow them, you want to smell them, you want them to be in your home, you want to feel connected to things that are growing because it's
Right.
beautiful. There's a difference between that and then just like getting on the internet and buying a really beautifully packaged, expensive, like bag of herbs so that you can have them in your home, so that you can like do the things that you want to do to be able to like access the power of plants or whatever.
Right.
But I think that the fact is that the way that our like media environment is organized right now, our social media environment, it's like the people who have the loudest voices in
Yep.
spaces are the ones who are selling something. And
Right.
so, right, it's the people who are making money off of selling you herb stuff that are have the loudest voices and that are the most influential. And, I think that's just the sort of like shitty algorithmically designed situation that we're in right now. And so
I mean,
we're
this is capitalism, right? This is what capitalism is a contamination to our economic system that has completely deteriorated our ability to connect. We don't even connect at the fucking grocery store anymore. We go through the automatic machine. Um, this is not a plug for this documentary, but I do want to say that I did watch it. Um, the documentary Inside the Manosphere on Netflix. I don't know if people have watched it. I watched it, and because I think about masculinity a lot, and I, you know, long time ago, someone said to me when I said I was trans, they said, but you're not a man," and I'm like, well, I'm not trying to become a man. I'm invested in masculinity, and I've always made that distinction, right? And so I watched this Inside the Manosphere, and I'm terrified at how young white international men are using social media to make money and to basically bankrupt everybody else. I mean, this is the new scam. This is the new means of production, and it's all happening on our phones.
And I think that if you do anything online, like you're constantly getting wrapped up into like the like MLM that is like
Right.
the internet and social media. I mean, like Substack is an example of that, right?
Yeah.
Where like, there's just all these opportunities to monetize your Substack and y- if you monetize your Substack, Substack promotes you, right?
Right.
It's just like
Right.
it's all part of the big MLM.
Right.
Like this is how we
Right.
talk to each other now.
Yeah.
This is the public. And um I think that, in that kind of an environment, the sorts of theological ideas that travel and that circulate and that end up getting recirculated are the ones that feel digestible,
Yeah.
familiar, provocative, and palatable,
Yeah.
marketable. And I think that this also means that there are so many just stranger, more unsettling, more important ideas that never make it into these conversations. All these weird ideas that I share with my students in the classroom. And so many of them are so like, I get a lot of students who are Christians, in my classroom, and a lot of them are really familiar with the Bible. They're really familiar with, the particular form of Christianity that they grew up
Yeah.
practicing. But
Yeah.
they're just, they're absolutely floored to learn more about their tradition. And I think it's sad that, this is a religious tradition that has so much political power in the United States, and yet it's
In
also
the
so
world.
in the world, and it's so, like, prepackaged, narrowly packaged, narrowly consumed. People don't understand all of the things that Christianity has inherited from other religious traditions. They don't understand the history of the tradition at all because nobody's really talking about this in the places where you're allowed to talk
Right.
about religion.
Right. I think so much about um Christmas and the pagan holidays that got appropriated into Christmas, and I'm like, why can't we honor the season change and the longest night of the year, and these things that help us feel more connected in a world that continuously reduces us to pressing sin.
And I think a lot of it does have to do with just the sort of received or packaged versions of things that
Yeah.
are the acceptable form. I mean, like it's like we essentially in the United States, the most powerful form of religion is essentially just like American cheese religion. It's just processed and packaged and it's easy to like distribute. It like keeps forever. It's basically like plastic, you
Right.
know? And I think that anything that sort of um looks weirder or like smells like real cheese is like, what is that?
Right.
Like
Right.
that's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
But I want to ask you a question too, because I think that in some ways we're like very much on the same page, but I
Yeah.
also think that in some ways we're also like kind of coming at some of this stuff from really different perspectives in the sense that like, I I know that in your work you are also very critical of the way that institutions have like shaped and formed these conversations that we're having about like religion and theology. And I totally understand and like, respect your critiques. And yet at the same time, I'm like a little bit of an institutionalist in the sense that like I work in one of these institutions. And as much as I'm like very critical of them, I also think I still like value the fact that, there are these institutions that have these like, spaces for conversation and things like that. And so I'm wondering like, what's your general take on theology as part of these like academic institutions? I mean, do you kind of feel like at the end of the day it's um kind of superfluous or yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I there's not too many people on like there was last time, so I feel not as anxious to answer this question. Um, but who knows who's gonna watch it afterwards. So I am riffing and I'm answering this in real time. I I am counter institutional. I'm not anti institutional, but I am counter institutional. And one of my chosen brothers, Colton Bernasol, who's one of my editors, um, I posed this question to him because I told him that we were gonna do another live on your recent article. And we were walking in Chicago and I was smoking a joint and we were walking to the lake and he said this to me. Um as long as people come together and have an experience or make meaning together, theology will never die. And I agree with that. I don't appreciate how some of these institutions, and I won't name any of them, are using public theology as a way to monetize and secure enrollment. I think that's a bad use of theology. Um, Theology for me primarily is about meaning making and it's bound up in our practices and in relationships. I think there is a lot of wisdom in before things, I mean, in the Middle Ages, there's some great things happening, but when you get towards a reformation and the consolidation of power and doctrines and whatnot, I get very nervous because you see how things get calcified through time. And so, you know, I have a deep appreciation for the Jewishness of Jesus and trying to understand the teachings of Jesus through Judaism. And so when I think about theology, I am already thinking about ethics. And I do think it all fits together. So I was trained as a systematic theologian, but in my PhD work, very constructive and sort of weird shit that I did in my PhD work. But yeah, as a counter institutional scholar practitioner, that's the phrase that I'm using this month. Um, I I think there are some things that do need to be put to death in a way to compost and 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 then steward that process of death. I don't think everything needs to be practical, or I don't think that we need to always be pushing the practical, because if we avoid wisdom, which I think there is some wisdom in some of the things in the early tradition, which are primarily composed of story. And so if we try to pursue wisdom as an act of courage in trying to teach theology, we necessarily have to use story to do that. And I don't think right now the institution is methodologically doing that. I think many institutions are capitalizing on the moment and doing degrees in public theology, creating centers of public theology, and it's basically about the all American dollar. So I'm much more interested in, um, and I'm going to say this after being devoted to Jill Deleuze for many years, but I'm really interested in recovering an inner life as a way to reimagine theology. So that's kind of where I am today, on April 7th.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of conflict, I think, with institutions in my mind at any rate, because I think that I have like a really like anti-authoritarian
Yeah,
like inner drive, but which makes like institutions just always kind of inherently like repressive and problematic in my mind. And I do think of them as like, they're always kind of inherently extractive, especially like in a capitalist environment. Even if they're a not-for-profit institution, they've got to
right,
continue like surviving as an institution, which means they've got to have a marketing scheme, and they've got to have like a thing that they're selling, and they've got to meet the market demand and things like that.
right.
So I feel really cynical about all of that, and yet I have this sense of gratitude for the fact that I ended up, and I ended up stumbling into theology. I wasn't a religious person,
Yeah,
and I didn't come to this field because I was interested in going to seminary to become a church leader or something like that. I was just a random person who wasn't religious but wanted to learn more about this stuff, and the like institutions ended up letting me in.
yeah, yeah,
And then they let me like get this PhD, and I'm grateful that I was able to, meet the collection of people that I met this way, and that I was able to like kind of enter the archives in
right.
essence, and that they became accessible to me in ways that are, it's really profound, and I'm, really grateful to have like a sense of access to those archives. And I think that despite all of the tension I feel about institutions and all of the kind of, work that they do that I feel a certain kind of hostility for, I am nevertheless like grateful for the fact that these structures and spaces existed where I could essentially do this work, this intellectual work. I could build the community that I built. Like I could learn what I learned. I could access the archives that I accessed. And
Yeah,
I worry about, and I think one of the reasons why I worry, again, I don't think theology is dying. People are going to always do theology.
right,
People are always going to be gathering in communities to do this. And
right,
there's always going to be that bond or that center that kind of, people create in various ways. But I think what worries me about the disappearance of, these more formal institutions like the ones where we did our PhD and things like that is that, even though they are these relics of Christendom, and I understand how politically problematic these institutions are, the way that they function under capitalism is problematic, I still appreciate the way that um, the kinds of communities they can create,
yeah,
the sorts of points of the points of access to the archives that they can also open up for people. And so I feel a little bit of like a sense of investment in like the tradition, to the extent that I feel, like it's a set of institutions that kind of enabled me to be a part of this conversation. And so yeah, it's with mixed feelings that I think
yeah.
about all this stuff.
I mean, me too. I spent every year of my PhD program at Princeton Theological Seminary, as part of the Hispanic Theological Initiative. I mean, I I spent a month at Harvard for the religion and sexuality seminar with Mark Jordan. I and none of I would fly there, and then they would put me up in these really nice accommodations. And being a poor kid from Texas, uh who straddled with student loan debt, now I could have never afforded those places. Um, and like so smart I'm dumb, but not smart enough to do some things and really stupid to do others. But how could you not love the fact that we had 6, 7, 8 years of marinating in ideas? I mean, I think about that, it's a real gift, that I was given, and also it's a burden that I carry these credentials of a PhD because I am suspect of the thing, and now I'm credentialed in a certain way, and, um, doors are open for me because of those 3 letters behind my name, um and like also mixed feelings and don't always know what to do with having a PhD. I feel like I'm a one trick pony, like this is what I can do. This is how I can feed people and I can have conversations about meaning making. But in with the rise of the algorithm, meaning making is going away. It's all about the clickbait.
Although I think there's a certain algorithmic meaning making that I think is if you're making meaning in the right way. I mean, there's always like a particular sort of meaning that's trending that
Yeah.
people are going to want to make, or that
Right.
like that'll get you like right. Like I think that I don't know if it's so much the case now. I do feel like especially even like 6 months ago, everybody was not everybody, but like my algorithm on Substack was just absolutely saturated with like people going offline and then coming back online to talk about how they went offline and how
Uh,
powerful it was. And right, like I think there's this. It was like maybe like 6 months ago. It was like the moment of like making meaning offline,
right.
and then you come back online to like tell everybody about the meaning that you made. And then, of course, like people were mocked because of the fact that they were online talking about this and everybody stopped
Right.
talking about it. But, right. I
Right.
mean, I do think that there are those like
Right.
certain like trending moments of just like what kind of meaning is it cool to make right now? And
Right.
like, how is it going to look like if I perform it this way or if I perform it that way?
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, it is all just sort of like algorithmically generated and,
Which is so bizarre to me. Like, I don't even know what to believe anymore. There's a thin line of, well, what is truth? And I'm resorting to conversations to try to mine the truth through story. I don't know if we'll get anywhere, but
yeah. I mean, I've certainly been taking this is gonna sound so academic, but but I've certainly been thinking more seriously about truth and taking truth more seriously than I used to.
yeah. Yeah.
I I won't say that I have like really like struck upon anything that I'm just like, no, that is true.
Yeah.
But
Someone once asked me, "Do I believe in a capital T truth?" And now I'm really thinking about that question, like, "Oh, maybe that
yeah.
should be our next conversation."
Well, I will say like just recently I I was talking with another academic and I said something like, whatever. Like, I think I just, I really want to know the truth about this or that or the other thing. And they were like, whoa, like, whoa, slow down. And I was just like, you know what? No, like um, I'm not going to be ashamed anymore of wanting like something true.
Right. Right.
I mean, but it is funny to think about how much of my like education has been kind of wrapped up in just sort of thinking critically about the idea of truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's in essence the sort of most true thing that I could do. And now that I think um, reality itself is fraying around, it's like it's fraying at the edges, I do think that I want to at least have a much more robust sense of truthfulness in the things that I'm doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
but figuring out what that actually means is another thing. But
Totally. I mean, I'm right now, uh, the police chief wants to come over for coffee. And, it shouldn't be any surprise, but I'm not pro police. And I'm really having to think about what does it mean to have this human being over for coffee, knowing that he's compromised.
can you ask him to come without a uniform? Like,
Right.
in plain clothes or, like as a person?
Yeah. Yeah. But like I want to be in right relationship with people. And um if healing is about you can't heal in loneliness. We heal in relationship. We heal because of conviviality. That's how we heal. So I'm trying to plant those seeds, and I just happen to have an opportunity with the police now, and I don't that's my dilemma. I don't know what to do because of this question of truth, you know?
Mhm.
So,
But at the same time, you're in a small town. The police chief is your neighbor. And, in that sense, being a neighbor and practicing neighborliness is also part of your ethic and your
right.
approach to life. And so, both of those things can be true, right?
Yeah.
You can be critical of who this person is in the public sphere, and yet also still have them in your home
Right.
as a neighbor and want to be in, you know, some form of relationship with them,
Yeah.
as a human.
Yeah.
But I think, these are all like very, I think, theologically loaded terms and concepts. And I when I look at my students, they're 18, 19, 20, they're young, they're kind of adrift. And I think a lot of them actually really want to be having conversations about truth. They recognize that it's messy. They understand that they are probably going to differ pretty radically from other people in the room. But,
Yeah.
I think that all of the young people in America deserve to have spaces where they
Yeah.
can talk about what truth is, what it means, and where they can get a little bit of historical context on why that's such a difficult conversation to have.
Right.
And yet, nevertheless, be able to kind of provisionally assemble together a sense of like what truth might mean for them, why it might be something they need, what it means to be a good neighbor, why these are conversations that are associated with ancient religious traditions, and why ancient religious traditions have been having these conversations. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, as much as I think that there's so much wrong with our educational institutions, I think that if they can do anything good for us into the future, I feel like that has to be a part of it. And
Yeah.
so, I don't know what the future holds when it comes to things like theology, and what what the future of even just education in the United States is going to look like. But I hope that we continue to be able to like open up these conversations and have these conversations in public because I feel like they're valuable.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep having them here and keep inviting people in. I just am noticing the time, and I know you have a hard stop, so I want to respect your time and just thank you for coming back on and continuing the conversation. And I look forward to our next one.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.